Empty temple platforms rise from Iraqi sand, their mud brick stairs leading nowhere, climbing towards spaces where gods no longer dwell. 5,000 years ago, these ziggurats bustled with priests making daily offerings to divine beings called the Anunnaki. Entities the Sumerians believed managed their cities, blessed their harvests, governed their fates. Then something changed. The texts themselves record it. Lamentation poems carved into clay describing how the gods departed, how they turned their faces away, how they abandoned the cities they had supposedly founded and protected for millennia. The question that haunts these ruins is simple yet profound. Why did the divine presence withdraw, and what does this departure tell us about why civilizations collapse? Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight, wherever this finds you. It's good you've chosen to spend these hours exploring one of archaeology's most poignant mysteries, the story of abandonment recorded by those who experienced it. The Sumerian civilization flourished for over 2,000 years before collapsing around 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur fell to Elamite invaders. But the archaeological evidence shows more than military defeat: soil salinization from over-irrigation, climate shifts toward increased aridity, demographic pressures from nomadic peoples moving into the region. The collapse was environmental, political, and cultural simultaneously. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the Sumerians themselves interpreted their civilization's end through a theological lens, writing detailed lamentation texts that describe their gods consciously choosing to leave, removing sacred objects from temples, departing to unknown destinations while their human worshippers begged them to stay. Mainstream scholars read these laments as sophisticated religious literature, theological responses to historical trauma, where military defeat and environmental catastrophe became cosmic drama. The gods departing represents a metaphor for divine disfavor, a way of making sense of unbearable losses by placing them in framework of cosmic order rather than meaningless chaos. Alternative researchers interpret the same texts differently, seeing literal descriptions of extraterrestrial beings completing their mission on Earth and physically departing, with civilization's collapse being the natural consequence of losing advanced guidance and support. We're not here to settle which interpretation is correct. Both perspectives deserve attention, because both grapple with the same essential mystery. Why do civilizations that seem permanent, blessed, destined to endure forever, suddenly crumble and fall silent? The Sumerian texts speak to anyone who's witnessed decline, who's seen certainty become uncertainty, presence become absence. Take a breath here. Let your shoulders ease downward, releasing whatever tension the day brought. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're in bed with darkness gathered around you, or perhaps on a couch with the house finally quiet. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. If this exploration resonates with you, a quick like or subscribe helps others discover these longer meditative journeys through ancient history. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you. Now then, imagine standing at the ziggurat of Ur at dawn, the great stepped pyramid built around 2100 BCE by King Ur-Nammu. The structure rises 21 meters above the plain, 3 massive platforms stacked like a stairway to heaven. Priests would have climbed these stairs daily, carrying offerings of bread and beer and meat to the temple at the summit where Nana the moon god supposedly resided. But walk those same stairs today, and you find only empty chambers, wind-scoured brick, silence where hymns once echoed. The gods, whether mythological constructs or literal beings, are gone. What remains are the questions they left behind, pressed into clay tablets that survived because the fires that destroyed the cities baked them harder, instead of reducing them to dust. Let us begin where all stories of loss must begin, with what was present before absence, with the weight of what these ruins once held. Standing at the archaeological site of Uruk today, you face a landscape of low-earth mounds spreading across 5.5 square kilometers of southern Iraqi desert, the largest ancient city in Mesopotamia, reduced to subtle undulations in otherwise flat terrain. The ziggurat that once rose 40 meters above the plain, visible for kilometers in every direction, now forms a weathered hill barely distinguishable from natural topography. Wind moves across these tells carrying fine dust that settles on everything. The same wind that's been working at these ruins for 4,000 years, grain by grain dismantling what human hands assembled brick by brick. The silence here feels almost physical, a presence rather than an absence. Where 60,000 people once lived in packed neighborhoods, conducted business in marketplaces, celebrated festivals in temple courtyards, now only jackrabbits and desert birds disturb the quiet. Archaeologists excavating these sites work in temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius during summer months, their trowels scraping through layers of collapsed mud brick that crumble like stale bread under minimal pressure. Each layer represents a different phase of occupation, households built atop the ruins of earlier households, streets rising gradually higher as debris accumulated beneath them. What strikes visitors most powerfully is the completeness of the abandonment. Cities don't usually empty all at once. Populations typically decline gradually, leaving stragglers who maintain some continuity with the past. But Sumerian urban centers show evidence of sudden massive depopulation in the early 2nd millennium BCE, with many sites never reoccupied at the same scale. Which supported perhaps 65,000 inhabitants at its peak around 2100 BCE, shrank to a small town of maybe 5,000 by 1900 BCE, then continued declining until complete abandonment, sometime before 500 BCE. The physical evidence of collapse appears in multiple forms. Defensive walls built in desperate final decades, thicker and higher than earlier fortifications, suggesting cities under siege or threat, hordes of valuables buried and never retrieved, indicating owners fled or died without returning, administrative tablets showing declining production figures year by year, grain harvests dropping from healthy surpluses to bare subsistence levels. The archaeological record doesn't lie about prosperity versus distress, and these final Sumerian layers tell stories of communities in crisis. Perhaps most poignant are the unfinished projects. At excavators found construction work on the ziggurat's third terrace that simply stopped mid-process, with building materials still stacked nearby, as if workers had set down their tools expecting to return tomorrow, but never came back. This frozen moment, preserved in brick and absence, speaks more eloquently than any text about sudden catastrophic disruption. Take a breath here. The weight of these ruins can feel heavy when contemplated too directly. Modern archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery reveal the full extent of what was lost. Beneath those seemingly empty mounds lie the remains of sophisticated cities with planned street grids, advanced drainage systems, multi-story buildings constructed around central courtyards. The sophistication rivals anything built in the ancient world, yet it all fell silent and empty within a few generations. Walking through excavated areas where walls still stand 2 to 3 meters high, their mud plaster bearing faint traces of painted geometric designs, you're confronted with the fragility of human achievement. These ruins represent more than one civilization's collapse. They embody a universal pattern that appears throughout human history, the cycle of rise and fall that no culture has escaped. The Sumerians themselves understood this, their king list recording dynasties that came and went, cities that held supremacy then lost it to rivals, an eternal rotation of power and decline. What they couldn't see, what perhaps no civilization can see while at its peak, is that the cycle applies to them too, that their own moment of dominance would pass into silence. The stars that wheel overhead at night, visible with spectacular clarity in the desert darkness far from modern cities, watch the entire arc from emergence to abandonment. Constellations the Sumerians named and tracked for agricultural timing, Pleiades rising to mark planting season, Orion's belt indicating harvest time. These stellar patterns continued their ancient rhythms completely indifferent to whether humans observed them or not. The cosmos didn't notice when the temples emptied and the hymns ceased. Yet something of Sumerian presence persists even in these ruins. The bricks themselves, sun-dried or kiln-fired, many stamped with names of the kings who commissioned their manufacture, remain legible after 40 centuries. Ur-Nammu built this wall. Shulgi expanded that temple. The names endure pressed into clay, defying the obliteration that claimed almost everything else. What we're examining isn't just archaeological debris but the physical remains of a theological crisis. Cities that believed themselves protected by divine favor, confronting the reality that such protection could be withdrawn. The ruins are silent now, but the texts they contain still speak of what it felt like when presence became absence, when the gods supposedly departed and left their creation to face consequences alone. Long before the abandonment, before the lamentation poems and empty temples, Sumerian civilization experienced what historians call the Ur-3 period, the last great flowering of Sumerian political independence, spanning from 2112 to 2004 BCE. This was the moment when everything worked, when the intricate system of irrigation agriculture, centralized administration, international trade, and religious ritual functioned in harmonious balance, producing unprecedented prosperity. Understanding what was lost requires seeing what existed at this peak, when Ur ruled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. The city of Ur during this period housed approximately 65,000 people within defensive walls enclosing 220 hectares of densely packed neighborhoods. The Great Ziggurat of Nana dominated the sacred precinct, a stepped pyramid measuring 64 meters long, 46 meters wide, and rising in 3 stages to a height exceeding 30 meters, with the topmost temple platform adding additional elevation. Staircases on 3 sides, each 6 meters wide, climbed to the summit where priests performed rituals visible to thousands gathered in the courtyard below. The structure consumed millions of mud bricks, its construction representing a staggering investment of labor, coordinated over years of intensive work. Imagine the city at dawn during a major festival. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires rises from residential quarters where families prepare morning meals, flatbread baking in domed ovens, fish grilling over charcoal brought from distant forests. The canals that crisscross the city reflect pink and gold from the rising sun, their waters carrying irrigation to fields and fresh drinking water to neighborhoods. Temple bells ring to mark the beginning of rituals, their bronze tones audible across the entire urban expanse. Processions form in designated assembly areas, priests wearing white linen robes and elaborate headdresses, musicians carrying lyres and drums, citizens dressed in their finest garments joining the ceremonial movement toward the ziggurat. The prosperity was real and measurable. Administrative tablets from Earth-Third archives record grain production exceeding 20,000 tons annually from temple-controlled estates, enough to feed the city with substantial surplus for trade. Barley served as currency for many transactions, with workers receiving monthly rations calculated precisely. A male laborer got approximately 60 litres per month, a female worker 30 litres, children proportionally less. These rations, supplemented with fish, dates and vegetables from private plots, provided adequate nutrition by ancient standards. Trade networks extended remarkably far. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, transported 2,000 kilometers overland and down rivers. Carnelian beads originated in the Indus Valley. Cedar timber arrived from Lebanon's mountains. Gold, silver, copper, tin, precious stones, exotic woods, all flowed into Ur's warehouses, where scribes recorded every transaction in meticulous cuneiform on clay tablets that still survive in museum archives. The city functioned as a commercial hub, connecting the ancient world's major civilizations, Persian Gulf maritime trade meeting, overland routes from Anatolia and Iran. The religious system provided the organizing principle for this complexity. The Temple of Nana wasn't just a place of worship, but the economic heart of the city, employing thousands in its estates, workshops, and administrative offices. Every transaction, every contract, every legal dispute ultimately referenced divine authority, with temple officials serving as witnesses and judges. Kings claimed their right to rule through divine selection, receiving authority directly from Enlil or Nana in ceremonies that reinforced the cosmic order underpinning social hierarchy. Perhaps what's most striking about Ur-3 civilization is its confidence, the sense conveyed through monumental architecture and administrative records that this system would endure forever. King Shulgi, who ruled from 2094 to 2047 BCE, commissioned inscriptions describing himself as King of the Four Quarters, claiming dominion over the entire known world. His hymns, preserved on tablets, celebrate his wisdom, strength, and piety, presenting him as the perfect intermediary between gods and humans. Nothing in these texts anticipates collapse or questions the permanence of Sumerian dominance. Cultural achievements matched political and economic success. Literature flourished, with scribal schools training hundreds of students in the complex art of cuneiform writing. The earliest known law code, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, emerged during this period, establishing legal principles that would influence Mesopotamian jurisprudence for millennia. Poetry exploring themes of love, mortality, divine justice, and human struggle reached sophistication that still resonates today. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled later, drew on Sumerian sources from this era. Astronomical observations conducted by temple priests achieved remarkable precision. Venus tablets tracked the planet's appearances and disappearances with accuracy, allowing modern astronomers to reconstruct ancient chronology. Lunar calendars synchronized with solar years through careful intercalation of extra months. Mathematical texts demonstrated understanding of geometric principles and algebraic thinking. This was a civilization operating at the cutting edge of human knowledge, pushing boundaries in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries after its collapse. Yet beneath this prosperity, vulnerabilities were accumulating unnoticed or ignored. The irrigation systems that made agriculture possible in an arid region were slowly poisoning the soil, mineral salts concentrating in fields with each watering cycle. The forests that provided timber were being depleted faster than natural regeneration could replace them. Climate patterns were shifting toward increased aridity, subtle changes that would compound existing stresses. The political stability depended on strong centralized authority that could coordinate vast territories, a system vulnerable to succession crises or military defeats. The Sumerians at their peak couldn't see these accumulating problems, or chose not to acknowledge them. Why would they question a system that had brought such success? The gods seemed pleased, accepting offerings and granting prosperity in return. The temples stood solid and permanent. The harvests, though perhaps declining slightly year by year, still sufficed. Everything that made Sumerian civilization magnificent was simultaneously making it fragile, creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that would prove fatal when multiple stresses hit simultaneously. This was the world before the silence, the moment of greatest achievement, balanced unknowingly on the edge of catastrophic decline. The earliest Sumerian texts describe gods as intimately involved in human affairs, present in their temples, actively managing their cities, responsive to prayers and offerings. This wasn't abstract theology, but practical relationship, daily interactions between worshippers and deities, mediated through priests and rituals. The texts convey a sense of divine accessibility, gods who could be petitioned, pleased or angered through human actions, beings concerned with the proper functioning of irrigation systems and the justice of legal decisions as much as with cosmic matters. Temple hymns from the 3rd millennium BCE address specific deities with remarkable directness. A hymn to Nana begins, "Father Nana, Lord of you who cross the heavens in brilliance." The text describes the moon god's nightly journey across the sky, his role in marking time and seasons, his residence in the great ziggurat. The language assumes presence, speaking to Nana as one might address a powerful patron who actually occupies his stated dwelling and responds to supplication. Other hymns detail the daily care of divine statues, washing them, clothing them in fine garments, offering them meals, treating the images as animate beings requiring physical maintenance. Royal inscriptions claim even more direct divine involvement. King Namu, founder of the Ur dynasty, describes receiving his commission to rule from the gods Anu and Enlil, who called his name and gave him authority over Sumer and Akkad. His son Shulgi goes further, claiming divine parentage, describing himself as born of Nana and beloved by Inanna. Whether these claims were literal beliefs or political rhetoric remains debated by scholars, but the texts themselves present divine authority as the foundation for earthly kingship, creating an unbroken chain from cosmic order to human governance. Administrative documents reveal how deeply religious frameworks penetrated daily life. Contracts invoke deities as witnesses, calling on Shamash, the sun god, who sees all things to ensure honesty in business dealings. Legal judgments reference divine law codes supposedly revealed to righteous kings. Even mundane economic records, tallies of grain shipments and livestock counts, often conclude with formulaic blessings requesting divine favor for the scribe and the institution. The gods weren't distant cosmic forces, but active participants in Sumerian society at every level. Ritual texts describe elaborate ceremonies intended to maintain divine presence in temples. The mispee or mouthwashing ritual transformed a newly carved statue into an actual god, animating the image through specific incantations and procedures. Once activated, the statue required daily service, washing, dressing, feeding, entertainment through music and dance. Temple archives record the quantities of food offered to gods each day, bread and beer and meat consumed through rituals where offerings were presented, then redistributed to priests and temple workers. The system assumed gods literally ate these meals, their statues serving as physical bodies requiring sustenance. Perhaps the most vivid evidence of assumed divine presence appears in oracle texts and dream accounts. Kings regularly consulted deities about political and military decisions through divination, examining animal livers or interpreting dreams for divine guidance. The god Enki supposedly appeared to King Gudea of Lagash in a dream, showing him detailed architectural plans for temple construction. These weren't understood as metaphorical visions, but as actual communications from divine beings who cared about proper temple design and wanted specific requirements met. The relationship between gods and humans was contractual and reciprocal. Humans provided worship, offerings, and temple maintenance. Gods provided protection, prosperity, and cosmic order. Texts describe this explicitly, with deities promising to bless cities that honor them properly and threatening punishment for those who neglect ritual obligations. The system made theological sense. If gods created humans to serve them, then continued divine presence depended on humans fulfilling that purpose through consistent worship. Boundary stones called kuduru, marking property lines and recording land grants, invoke elaborate curses on anyone who violates the boundaries, calling on specific gods to punish transgressors with disease, poverty, and death. The curses assume gods actively monitor human behavior and enforce justice through direct intervention. Nana will cause blindness. Ninurta will shatter bones. Ishtar will bring impotence. The curses specify with grim precision. This wasn't empty rhetoric, but reflected genuine belief that deities paid attention to property disputes and acted to protect the righteous. Yet even in texts describing divine presence, hints of distance and absence occasionally appear. Some hymns take the form of complaints, asking why gods have hidden their faces or failed to respond to prayers. A king might describe rebuilding a temple that had fallen into ruins, suggesting periodic abandonment or divine displeasure. These moments are rare in early texts, but become more frequent in later periods, subtle indicators that the relationship wasn't always stable, that divine presence couldn't be taken for granted indefinitely. The confidence of early Sumerian religion, its assumption that gods dwelled among humans and managed their cities, would eventually face severe challenges. When catastrophes struck that prayers couldn't prevent and offerings couldn't appease, when the basic contract seemed to break down with gods failing to protect their worshippers despite proper ritual observance, the theological crisis would prove as devastating as the physical collapse. For now, though, the texts describe a world where divine presence was assumed, expected, ritualized into every aspect of life from agriculture to law to kingship. Understanding this baseline makes the subsequent absence more profound, makes the lamentation literature we'll explore more poignant. The texts of presence establish what was lost when the gods, whether through mythological narrative or literal departure, supposedly turned away from the civilization that had served them for 2,000 years. The first signs of trouble appear in texts from the late 3rd millennium BCE, subtle shifts in tone where confidence gives way to anxiety, where hymns of praise begin incorporating elements of complaint and supplication. These aren't yet the full lamentation poems describing total abandonment, but rather warning signals, theological tremors indicating stress in the relationship between gods and their worshippers. Reading these texts chronologically reveals a civilization gradually recognizing that divine favor cannot be assumed as permanent, that the contract binding heaven and earth might be fragile. A cylinder inscription from around 2200 BCE, during the Akkadian period just before III, describes the reign of King Naram-Sin and his conflicts with the gods. The text, discovered at Nippur and now housed in the Louvre, recounts how Naram-Sin destroyed the temple of Enlil at Nippur in anger after receiving unfavorable omens. The inscription describes divine retaliation swift and severe. The gods brought down the Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros, who invaded Mesopotamia and ended Akkadian dominance. The narrative establishes a pattern where divine displeasure manifests as military defeat and political chaos, setting a template that later texts would follow. The Curse of Agade represents perhaps the most explicit early warning text. This literary composition, known from copies made centuries after the events it describes, tells how King Naram-Sin's sacrilege against Enlil's temple brought catastrophic punishment. The text describes Enlil summoning barbarian hordes to devastate Akkad, the capital city, reducing it to ruins. What makes this significant is the theological framework. Human transgression leads to divine withdrawal of protection, which permits earthly disaster. The gods don't directly destroy, they simply step back and allow natural consequences to unfold. The language in these warning texts often employs weather metaphors. Divine anger appears as storms, darkness, clouds obscuring the sun, winds that strip vegetation from fields. Enlil's displeasure manifests as tempests that flatten crops and overturn boats on canals. These metaphors weren't purely symbolic. They reflected the environmental reality of Mesopotamian agriculture, where storms could indeed devastate harvests, where climate shifts meant the difference between prosperity and famine. Perhaps the texts encoded observations of actual environmental deterioration that threatened agricultural productivity. Other texts from this transitional period describe gods turning their faces away from cities, a phrase that appears with increasing frequency. When a god turns away, the divine gaze that protects and blesses no longer rests on that location, leaving it vulnerable to human enemies and natural disasters. The image suggests withdrawal rather than active punishment, distance replacing presence. Some inscriptions attempt to reverse this turning away through elaborate restoration projects, kings rebuilding neglected temples and reinstating proper rituals to coax deities back into active engagement. Administrative documents provide another form of warning, though one the ancients may not have fully recognized. Tablets from later Third archives show declining agricultural yields across successive years, barley production dropping from approximately 2,500 litres per hectare in good years to below 1,800 litres in the empire's final decades. These numbers represent objective evidence of environmental stress, whether from soil salinization, climate shifts, or both. The gods weren't actually withdrawing their favour, but natural systems were degrading in ways that would have felt like divine abandonment to people interpreting causation through religious frameworks. References to border conflicts increase in frequency during the late III period. Texts describe building defensive walls, campaigns against the Martu or Amorites moving in from the western desert, Military expenses consuming resources previously allocated to temple construction and maintenance. King Shu-Sin, ruling from 2037 to 2029 BCE, commissioned a defensive wall stretching 270 kilometers across northern Mesopotamia, attempting to exclude nomadic raiders. The wall's construction suggests desperation, an empire under pressure deploying massive resources for defense, rather than the confident expansion that characterized earlier reigns. Prayer texts from this period adopt increasingly desperate tones. Where earlier prayers expressed confidence that proper ritual would secure divine favor, later prayers plead and bargain, offering ever more elaborate sacrifices if gods will only listen, only help, only turn their faces back toward their suffering worshippers. The shift from confidence to pleading marks a theological crisis developing alongside the political and environmental stresses. If the contract between gods and humans functioned through reciprocal obligations, what did it mean when humans fulfilled their part but gods seemed unresponsive? Dream omens and divination records show preoccupation with determining divine will in uncertain times. Kings consulted omens before every major decision, examining sheep livers for patterns indicating favor or disfavor, recording dreams that might contain divine messages. The frequency of consultation increased as conditions worsened, suggesting rulers desperately seeking reassurance or guidance that traditional rituals no longer provided. When every omen seems unfavorable, when dreams bring warnings rather than encouragement, the psychological toll must have been immense. Yet even these warning texts maintain hope that proper action could restore divine favor. They describe specific transgressions that angered the gods, and specific remedies that might appease them. This preserved a sense of agency, the belief that humans could influence their fate through ritual correction and moral reform. The complete despair of the full lamentation texts lay in the future, when it became clear that no amount of proper worship could reverse the collapse already in motion. The warnings were there, recorded in clay for anyone who could read the accumulating signs: environmental degradation, military pressure, divine distance, all documented in texts that historians can now arrange chronologically to watch a civilization sliding toward catastrophe, while still believing intervention might save it. Among the most remarkable documents surviving from ancient Mesopotamia are the lamentation texts, long poetic compositions describing in vivid detail the destruction of Sumerian cities and the departure of their protective deities. These weren't historical chronicles, but theological responses to trauma, attempts to make sense of catastrophic loss by placing it in framework of divine will and cosmic order. 5 major city laments survive in various states of preservation, each following similar structure but focusing on different urban centers: Ura, Sumer, and Ura, Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur stands as the most complete and emotionally powerful of these texts. Composed sometime shortly after Ur's fall in 2004 BCE, it stretches across 436 lines divided into 11 songs or sections, each exploring different aspects of the catastrophe, from multiple perspectives. The text wasn't discovered as a single complete tablet, but pieced together from fragments found at multiple sites, a jigsaw puzzle of ancient grief scattered across southern Iraq. Samuel Noah Kramer, the pioneering Sumerologist, worked on translating lamentation texts throughout the mid-20th century at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. In 1940, he sat in his office, examining a fragment catalogued years earlier as UET 6 halves 402, a damaged clay tablet from the University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s. The fragment measured approximately 8 centimeters by 6 centimeters, its edges broken irregularly where the original tablet had shattered. Kramer could see cuneiform signs pressed into reddish clay, the writing clear despite surface wear. As he began working through the text, recognizing grammatical patterns and vocabulary, he realized he was reading a first-person account from the perspective of the goddess Ningal, Nanna's consort, describing her experience of Ur's destruction. The goddess speaks of pleading before the divine council, begging them to spare her city, being overruled by Enlil's decree that destruction must proceed. She describes watching helplessly as her temple is violated, her city burned, her people slaughtered or enslaved. Kramer's translation of this fragment and others revealed the lament's sophisticated literary structure, their use of repetition for emotional emphasis, their alternation between divine and human perspectives. He published his work in academic journals throughout the 1940s and 1950s, gradually building the complete text from scattered pieces and making these ancient poems accessible to modern readers. The lamentation texts describe divine departure with specific concrete details. In the Ur lament, Nanna decides to abandon his city, removing himself from his temple. Nangal describes the moment. He who used to ride out from the city, where now does he dwell? Nana, who used to ride out from the city, where now does he dwell? The repetition hammers home the absence, the space where divine presence should reside now empty. Other gods follow. Inanna leaves Uruk, Ninlil departs from Nipper, each taking with them the me, the divine principles or powers that made their cities function and prosper. The physical destruction accompanying divine withdrawal appears in harrowing imagery. Flames consume temples and palaces, walls crumble under enemy assault, bodies lie unburied in streets. Survivors wander dazed among ruins, searching for family members, finding only corpses. The texts spare no detail in depicting urban catastrophe, creating poetry from horror that serves both as memorial and as warning. These disasters happened, they can happen again. Proper worship offers no absolute guarantee against divine displeasure. What makes the laments particularly striking is their emotional honesty about divine behavior. The gods appear conflicted, even cruel. Enlil decrees destruction despite other deities' protests. Nanna and Ningol weep for their city, but cannot or will not prevent its destruction. The divine council operates through cold political calculation, deciding that must fall to restore cosmic balance disrupted by unnamed Sumerian transgressions. No clear explanation appears for why this punishment fits the supposed crime, leaving an impression of arbitrary divine justice that mirrors the arbitrary nature of historical catastrophes. The texts also reveal theological wrestling, with questions of divine power and responsibility. If gods truly control events, why would they destroy their own worshippers and temples? If they don't control events, what kind of gods are they? The laments offer no satisfying resolution, instead maintaining tension between divine agency and divine limitation. Perhaps this ambiguity served a purpose, allowing survivors to maintain faith in their god's existence while acknowledging their apparent failure to protect. Ritual context matters for understanding these laments. They weren't private reading material but public performances, recited during annual commemorative ceremonies that transformed trauma into communal memory. Each year, priests would chant these texts in temples rebuilt after destruction, keeping alive the story of what was lost. The performances served cathartic functions, providing structured outlets for grief while simultaneously reinforcing theological frameworks that made suffering meaningful through divine purpose. Modern scholars debate whether the laments describe historical events with accuracy or use destruction as literary trope. Archaeological evidence confirms that Nippur, and other cities experienced violent destruction around 2000 BCE, with burn layers and hastily buried bodies supporting the text's accounts of warfare and catastrophe. But the laments' theological framing, their insertion of divine characters and cosmic drama, transforms whatever historical events occurred into something other than straightforward reporting. The question persists: did the Sumerians who composed and performed these laments actually believe their gods had literally departed, or did they understand divine departure as metaphor for loss of divine favor? The texts themselves don't clarify this distinction, perhaps because the question would have seemed meaningless to their creators. In a worldview where divine will manifests through earthly events, the difference between gods literally leaving and gods withdrawing protection collapses into the same practical reality. These lamentation texts would be copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, long after Sumerian ceased being a spoken language. Later Babylonian scribes preserved them as classical literature, sacred texts that spoke to universal experiences of loss and abandonment that transcended any specific historical moment. The lamentation texts don't merely report that gods departed, they describe the process in remarkable detail, creating a step-by-step account of how divine presence withdraws from a city and what that withdrawal looks like from both human and divine perspectives. These procedural descriptions reveal sophisticated theological thinking about the nature of divine dwelling and the mechanics of sacred space, concepts that would seem abstract, except the texts ground them in concrete physical actions and observable consequences. The departure sequence typically begins with a divine council meeting in heaven, the Ubshukinaku, where the great gods assemble to make decisions affecting cosmic order. Enlil, as king of the gods, proposes that a particular city must be destroyed as punishment for unspecified offenses against divine law. Other deities may protest, particularly the god or goddess who serves as that city's patron, but Enlil's authority generally prevails. The council votes, destiny is decreed, and the mechanism of destruction is set in motion. This assembly scene appears in multiple laments with slight variations, suggesting it represented standard theological understanding of how divine decisions were made. Once the council reaches its decree, the patron deity faces a choice: remain in the doomed city and share its fate, or depart and survive. The texts consistently show gods choosing departure despite emotional attachments to their cities and worshippers. In the lamentation over Nana and Ningal spend time pleading before the council, attempting to change the decree, but when efforts fail they begin preparations to leave. The goddess Bao similarly abandons her city of Lagash, and Inanna departs from Uruk. The pattern suggests a theological principle that gods, despite their power, cannot or will not oppose the collective decision of the divine assembly. The physical act of departure involves removing sacred objects from temples, particularly the Mi, those mysterious divine principles or powers that govern civilized life. The texts describe gods gathering these precious items, packing them as one might pack valuables when fleeing a disaster. In some versions, the Mi are described as physical objects that can be carried, while in others they seem more abstract, capabilities or blessings that exist in the presence of the deity, and vanish when the deity withdraws. This ambiguity might reflect genuine theological uncertainty about whether divine power resides in objects, in the gods themselves, or in the relationship between gods and places. Architectural descriptions appear frequently in the departure narratives. Gods emerge from the innermost sanctuaries of their temples, passing through successive courtyards and gates as they move from sacred center toward the city's edge. The lamentation over Ura describes Nana walking through 7 gates, each representing a threshold between increasingly profane spaces. At each gate the god pauses, perhaps looking back. The texts suggest reluctance and sorrow despite the inevitability of leaving. These architectural details ground the theological drama in real temple layouts that audiences would recognize, making divine action comprehensible through analogy to human movement, through known spaces. The moment of actual departure often employs storm and darkness imagery. As gods leave their temples, destructive forces immediately sweep in, as if divine presence had been holding chaos at bay, and its removal permits entropy to surge forward. Fire appears frequently, whether from enemy torches, lightning strikes, or spontaneous combustion of materials no longer protected by sacred power. Winds tear at structures, dust storms obscure vision, darkness falls even at midday. Whether these represent literal environmental catastrophes or metaphorical expressions of social collapse remains ambiguous in the texts. Human responses to divine departure range from incomprehension to desperate attempts at retention. Some texts describe priests performing emergency rituals, making extraordinary offerings, even attempting to physically restrain divine statues, as if preventing the statue from leaving might keep the god present. These efforts always fail, the texts make clear, because what's happening operates at a level beyond human ability to prevent or reverse. The powerlessness of human ritual in the face of divine decision represents a profound theological shift from earlier confidence in the efficacy of proper worship. The aftermath of departure appears in vivid detail. Temples become empty husks, their statues gone, their altars cold, their courtyards silent except for wind. The absence of divine presence manifests physically through decay and neglect, as if buildings themselves recognize they no longer serve their original purpose. Walls begin crumbling, roofs collapse, vegetation invades courtyards. The text suggests sacred architecture requires divine animation to maintain coherence, that buildings are more than inert materials, but somehow alive in the presence of the deity and dead without it. Enemy invasion typically follows divine departure rather than causing it. The gods leave first, removing their protection, then human enemies arrive to complete the destruction that divine withdrawal initiated. This sequence matters theologically because it places responsibility for catastrophe on divine decision rather than human military prowess. The Elamites who sacked in 2004 BCE appear in the laments not as autonomous agents, but as instruments of divine will, executors of punishment, decreed in heaven. This framing preserves divine sovereignty while acknowledging human suffering. Some texts hint at possible divine return under unspecified future conditions. The gods haven't necessarily abandoned their cities permanently, but rather withdrawn temporarily until proper order is restored. This preserves hope that divine favor might be regained, that temples could be rebuilt and deities welcomed back through sufficient penitence and ritual correction. Later Babylonian kings would indeed rebuild Sumerian temples and reinstitute worship, claiming to restore what was lost, though whether they believed they were actually bringing gods back or simply maintaining cultural traditions remains unclear from surviving records. The mechanical precision of these departure descriptions suggests the laments served didactic purposes beyond mere expression of grief. They taught theological principles about divine human relations, divine council operations, the nature of sacred space, and the conditionality of divine protection. Every element of the departure sequence carried meaning, demonstrating how the cosmological order actually functioned when pushed to crisis. What remains most haunting in these texts is their matter-of-fact acceptance that gods can leave, that divine presence isn't permanent or unconditional. The departure might be sorrowful, might inspire lamentation, but it's portrayed as within the normal range of possibilities for divine-human interaction, rather than as unprecedented catastrophe. This suggests Sumerians understood their relationship with the divine as dynamic and potentially fragile, always requiring maintenance, never simply guaranteed. The mechanics of abandonment, once understood, couldn't be forgotten. Future civilizations inheriting these texts would know that divine favor could be withdrawn, that cities could be left to face destruction alone, that no amount of proper worship guaranteed protection if the gods in assembly decided otherwise. The year 2004 BCE marks a definitive break in Mesopotamian history, the moment when Sumerian political independence ended, not through gradual decline, but through sudden military catastrophe. King Ibbi-Sin sat on Ur's throne, the fifth and final ruler of the Ur III dynasty, presiding over an empire that had already shrunk dramatically from its greatest extent under his predecessors. Archives from his 24-year reign document a cascade of failures, each year bringing new losses as outlying provinces broke away and resources dwindled. The texts reveal an administration still functioning, still keeping meticulous records, even as the state it served collapsed around it. Ibbi-Sin's reign began in 2028 BCE, inheriting an empire under stress. His father Shu-Sin had built the Great Wall, attempting to exclude Amorite nomads, a defensive posture suggesting weakness rather than strength. Within years of taking power, Ibbi-Sin lost control of provinces in the north and east, local governors declaring independence and refusing to send tribute. The cuneiform tablets from this period read like desperate dispatches from a failing state, appeals for military support that couldn't be provided, reports of grain shortages, records of prices inflating as supplies diminished. The Elamites, based in what's now southwestern Iran, had long competed with Mesopotamian states for regional dominance. Under their king Kendatu, they saw opportunity in Ur's weakness and launched an invasion aimed at sacking the capital and breaking Sumerian power permanently. The attack came around 2004 BCE, though precise chronology remains debated among scholars who work to correlate Mesopotamian king lists with astronomical observations and archaeological stratigraphy. What isn't debated is the outcome. Ur fell, Ibbi-Sin was captured and taken to Elam in chains, and the city that had ruled southern Mesopotamia for over a century became a tributary subject to foreign masters. Archaeological evidence confirms violent destruction layers at Ur, dating to this period. Excavations by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s revealed buildings burned so intensely that mud brick was fired to ceramic hardness, a transformation requiring sustained high temperatures from deliberately set fires rather than accidental blazes. Human remains appear in positions suggesting hasty burial or no burial at all. Bodies left where they fell during the assault. The ziggurat itself survived relatively intact, too massive to demolish, but surrounding structures show signs of systematic looting and destruction. The royal cemetery, which Woolley excavated to international acclaim in 1927 to 1928, contained burials from much earlier periods around 2600 BC, but the site's later phases show how subsequent inhabitants treated these ancient graves, looting them for valuables and disturbing the dead in ways that suggest desperation or disrespect. This archaeological detail speaks to social breakdown, the abandonment of norms that had previously protected ancestral burials from disturbance even during difficult times. Imagine the final days before Ur's fall, Elamite forces approaching from the east, visible as dust clouds on the horizon, growing larger each day. The city's defensive walls, impressive at 8 meters thick and rising perhaps 12 meters high, had proven adequate against earlier raids, but faced a determined army with siege equipment and time. Inside, the population must have swelled with refugees from surrounding villages, seeking protection behind urban fortifications. Food stores depleted faster than anticipated. Arguments erupted about whether to surrender or resist, whether the gods would intervene or had already abandoned the city to its fate. The physical collapse, catastrophic as it was, represented only the visible manifestation of deeper systemic failures that had been accumulating for decades. Military defeat doesn't happen in isolation, but emerges from underlying economic, environmental, and social vulnerabilities that erode state capacity until external pressure finds weak points and exploitation becomes inevitable. The Elamites didn't cause Ur III's collapse so much as deliver the final blow to a structure already critically damaged by internal stresses. What's remarkable isn't that Ur fell, but that the catastrophe was so thoroughly documented. Scribes continued writing tablets during the final chaotic years, recording grain prices, legal disputes, temple offerings, maintaining bureaucratic routine, even as the empire disintegrated. These tablets, scattered when archives were destroyed or looted, now provide historians with detailed chronology of collapse, year-by-year accounts of deteriorating conditions. The Sumerians documented their own ending with the same meticulous attention they devoted to their prosperity. Yet even in defeat, aspects of Sumerian culture persisted. The Elamite conquerors didn't erase Mesopotamian civilization, but rather absorbed elements of it, adopting cuneiform writing and some administrative practices. Later, when Elamite power faded and new dynasties arose in Mesopotamia under Amorite and Babylonian leadership, they claimed continuity with the Sumerian past, rebuilt temples, and preserved literature in Sumerian, even though the language had ceased being spoken. The political collapse was total, but cultural collapse proved incomplete. The fall of Ur in 2004 BCE serves as a hard chronological marker, a definite moment separating eras. Before this date, Sumerian kings ruled an independent state. After it, Sumerian culture survived only as inheritance claimed by successor civilizations who built on its foundations while transforming it into something new. The question remains whether this transformation represents ending or evolution, death or metamorphosis. Beneath the dramatic narrative of military defeat and divine abandonment lies a more prosaic but equally devastating crisis: the slow poisoning of Mesopotamian soil through irrigation agriculture, practiced without understanding its long-term consequences. This environmental catastrophe unfolded over centuries, invisible to those experiencing it, year by year, accumulating to levels that made continued intensive agriculture impossible in regions that had been civilization's breadbasket. Modern soil science applied to ancient agricultural zones reveals what the Sumerians couldn't see. Their success was consuming the foundation on which it stood. The process operates through basic chemistry and hydrology. Mesopotamian soil, fertile when first irrigated, contains mineral salts in relatively low concentrations. When water from the Tigris or Euphrates flows through irrigation canals and is applied to fields, it doesn't drain efficiently because the underlying clay prevents vertical percolation. Instead, water sits in the root zone and gradually evaporates, leaving dissolved salts behind. Each irrigation cycle deposits another thin layer of salt. Over decades and centuries, concentrations build to toxic levels that most crops cannot tolerate. Soil samples collected by archaeologists working at ancient Sumerian sites show salt concentrations reaching 2 to 3% by weight in the root zone, levels that suppress or prevent growth of wheat, the preferred grain crop. Barley tolerates higher salinity, and the agricultural record shows a clear shift from wheat to barley cultivation during the late 3rd millennium BCE. Administrative tablets from Ur-3rd archives document this transition. Wheat harvests declined year after year while barley cultivation expanded to compensate. By 2000 BCE, wheat had nearly disappeared from southern Mesopotamian agriculture, replaced almost entirely by the more salt-tolerant but less desirable barley. The yield figures preserved in cuneiform tablets tell a grim story of declining productivity. Early Sumerian fields could produce 2,500 litres of grain per hectare under optimal conditions. By the Ur-3rd period, average yields had dropped to around 1,800 litres per hectare, a 28% reduction that meant significantly less surplus for supporting urban populations, maintaining armies, and conducting trade. The decline continued into the early 2nd millennium BCE, with some areas producing barely 1,000 litres per hectare, harvest margins so thin that a single bad season could trigger famine. Farmers noticed the problem and attempted remediation through techniques that sometimes helped, but couldn't reverse the fundamental process. They allowed fields to lie fallow for a year or more, hoping salt would leach away, but without proper drainage, this proved largely ineffective. They dug deeper canals trying to improve water flow, but this sometimes brought salt-laden groundwater to the surface, worsening contamination. They shifted cultivation to new areas as old fields failed, but virgin land was limited, and eventually all available territory showed salinization. Climate shifts compounded the soil chemistry problem. Paleoclimatic research using ice cores, lake sediments and marine cores from the Persian Gulf indicates increasing aridity in the Middle East between 2200 and 2000 BCE, part of a broader climate event that affected civilizations from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Reduced rainfall meant less water available for irrigation and less natural leaching of salts from soil. Rivers ran lower, making canal management more difficult. The combination of declining precipitation and degraded soil created conditions where agricultural productivity couldn't support existing population levels. Evidence for environmental stress appears in settlement patterns documented through archaeological surveys. During the early 3rd millennium BCE, settlements spread widely across southern Mesopotamia, with small villages dotting the landscape between major cities. By 2000 BCE, many rural sites had been abandoned, populations consolidating in fewer, larger centers. This centralization suggests agricultural failure, forcing people to relocate, abandoning areas where farming no longer yielded sufficient returns. The landscape literally emptied as environmental degradation made dispersed settlement patterns unsustainable. Tree ring data from ancient timbers preserved in archaeological contexts shows narrower growth rings during the late 3rd millennium BCE, another indicator of environmental stress affecting not just crops but all vegetation. The forests that provided timber for construction were already depleted from centuries of harvesting, and drought conditions prevented natural regeneration. Mesopotamia had never been heavily forested, but the limited woodland resources it possessed were exhausted, forcing reliance on imported timber from distant mountains at increasing cost. The Sumerians lacked scientific frameworks for understanding soil chemistry and long-term environmental change. They interpreted declining harvests as divine displeasure rather than ecological degradation, assuming ritual failures angered the gods who controlled agricultural fertility. This theological interpretation, while scientifically incorrect, wasn't entirely wrong in identifying human action as the cause. The intensive irrigation that salinized the soil was indeed a human choice, even if its consequences weren't understood. The laments describing divine abandonment might be read as expressing, in the only available vocabulary, the recognition that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between civilization and the land that sustained it. Modern parallels make this ancient environmental collapse feel uncomfortably relevant. Soil salinization continues affecting irrigated agriculture in arid regions worldwide. The Aral Sea basin in Central Asia has experienced catastrophic salinization from Soviet-era irrigation projects. California's Central Valley faces ongoing salt management challenges. The Sumerians weren't uniquely foolish, but rather encountered problems inherent in intensive agriculture, practiced without long-term sustainability considerations. Problems that persist wherever similar conditions exist. The soil still holds this history. Salt crystals accumulating in ancient field systems that haven't supported crops for 4 millennia. Scientists can sample these soils and reconstruct productivity decline through mineral analysis, providing objective confirmation of what cuneiform tablets record subjectively as divine displeasure and failing harvests. The earth remembers what humans forgot, preserving in chemical signatures the slow catastrophe that undermined civilization from below, while attention focused on wars and temples above. While environmental degradation weakened Sumerian agriculture from within, demographic pressures built from without, as nomadic peoples called the Martu or Amorites began moving into Mesopotamia in increasing numbers during the late 3rd millennium BCE. These migrations weren't organized invasions, but rather gradual infiltration, families and clans seeking better pasturage and economic opportunities in the settled agricultural zones. The relationship between nomadic herders and settled farmers had always involved tension, but around 2100 BCE, this tension escalated into conflict that Sumerian texts describe with anxiety, bordering on xenophobic panic. Amorite peoples originated in the Syrian desert and the fringes of the Levant, practicing pastoral nomadism focused on sheep and goat herding. They spoke a West Semitic language related to, but distinct from the Akkadian spoken in Mesopotamia, and their cultural practices differed from urban Sumerian norms in ways that city dwellers found disturbing. Sumerian texts describe the Martu as people who know not grain, who eat raw meat, who don't bury their dead properly, who live in tents rather than proper houses. These characterizations reveal more about Sumerian prejudices than about Amorite realities, but they indicate genuine cultural clash between settled and nomadic lifestyles. The actual Amorite migrations probably involved push and pull factors operating simultaneously. Climate shifts that stressed Mesopotamian agriculture also affected pasture lands, forcing herders to range more widely in search of fodder for their flocks. At the same time, Mesopotamian cities offered economic opportunities for people willing to work as laborers, soldiers, or merchants. Some Amorites entered Sumerian society peacefully, taking urban jobs and gradually assimilating. Others came as raiders, attacking caravans and isolated settlements, creating security problems that required military responses earthly rulers increasingly couldn't provide. King Shusin's construction of a massive defensive wall called the Amorite Wall, around 2030 BCE, represents the most dramatic response to migration pressure. The wall stretched approximately 270 kilometers across northern Mesopotamia, attempting to create a barrier excluding nomads from the agricultural heartland. Building this structure required enormous resources, thousands of workers laboring for years to move millions of cubic meters of earth and brick. Tablets describing the wall's construction treat it as a great achievement, but the very need for such defenses indicates the empire's vulnerability. The wall ultimately failed to exclude Amorites or prevent Ur-Third's collapse. Defensive barriers work only when adequately garrisoned and maintained, both requiring resources that the declining empire lacked. More fundamentally, walls can't stop gradual infiltration by people willing to work within the system, rather than attacking it directly. Many Amorites entered Mesopotamian service as mercenary soldiers, precisely the forces supposed to man defensive installations. Others established settlements in marginal areas outside direct state control, creating facts on the ground that central authority couldn't reverse. A young Amorite shepherd named Ishbi-Erra worked in Ur-Third's military service during King Ibisin's reign, rising through ranks to command troops defending against both foreign invasions and internal rebellions. Administrative tablets from around 2017 BCE record him being sent to Isin, a city north of Ur, with authority to purchase grain and maintain order in that region. Instead of sending the grain to Ur as ordered, Ishbi-Erra declared independence and established himself as king of Isin, founding a new dynasty that would dominate Mesopotamia after Ur's fall. He claimed legitimacy by portraying himself as the god's chosen successor to failed Sumerian rule, arguing that divine favor had transferred to him because the old dynasty had lost heaven's mandate. His letters to Ibisin, preserved in later copies, show calculating political maneuvering dressed in religious rhetoric, explaining why he couldn't send aid to Ur while positioning himself to benefit from its collapse. Ishbi-Erra's successful rebellion demonstrated how Amorite integration had proceeded far enough that ethnic outsiders could claim political authority using traditional Mesopotamian legitimating formulas. He ruled not as a foreign conqueror, but as a Mesopotamian king, who happened to be of Amorite extraction, a crucial distinction that allowed cultural continuity despite political transformation. The successor states that emerged after Ur-Third's collapse were largely ruled by Amorite dynasties: Isin, Larsa, Babylon itself under its famous king Hammurabi. These rulers adopted Sumerian and Akkadian languages for administration, patronized traditional temples, claimed descent from legendary Sumerian kings, and presented themselves as restorers of proper order rather than revolutionary usurpers. The old Sumerian aristocracy was displaced, but Sumerian culture survived in modified form under new management. Population genetic studies of modern Middle Eastern populations can't definitively trace Amorite migrations. Too many subsequent population movements have obscured ancient patterns, but linguistic evidence shows clearly how West Semitic languages became dominant in regions previously speaking Sumerian and Akkadian. The Amorite migrations changed Mesopotamia's ethnic and linguistic composition permanently, though the cultural transformation proceeded gradually rather than through sudden replacement. From the Sumerian perspective, Amorite success must have seemed like civilizational failure, barbarians triumphing over sophisticated urban culture. The lamentation texts express this anxiety, describing invaders defiling temples and violating sacred norms. But from a longer historical perspective, the Amorite period represents cultural fusion rather than destruction, nomadic vitality revitalizing aging urban traditions, creating hybrid societies that would flourish for another 1,000 years. The migration period demonstrates how civilizations don't end through simple external conquest, but rather through complex interactions between internal weakness and external pressure. The Amorites didn't destroy Sumerian civilization, they inherited and transformed it, becoming the next chapter in Mesopotamian history, rather than its conclusion. Determining exactly when Sumerian civilization ended depends on how you define ending, what markers you use to distinguish transformation from termination. The military defeat of 2004 BCE that brought down the Ur-3 dynasty didn't erase Sumerian culture instantly, but initiated a long twilight where Sumerian identity gradually faded, while Sumerian cultural heritage persisted in modified forms. This wasn't death so much as metamorphosis, one civilization dissolving into successor cultures that maintained continuity, even while introducing fundamental changes. The Sumerian language provides the clearest marker of civilizational transformation. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian had ceased being spoken in daily life, replaced by Akkadian and increasingly by Amorite dialects as the dominant vernacular languages. Yet Sumerian didn't die completely, but rather became a liturgical and scholarly language, comparable to Latin in medieval Europe or Sanskrit in classical India. Scribal schools continued teaching Sumerian for another 1,000 years. Priests recited hymns in Sumerian at temple ceremonies. Legal documents employed Sumerian formulas alongside Akkadian translations. The language survived as sacred tongue long after anyone used it for ordinary conversation. Babylonian scribes of the early 2nd millennium BCE copied Sumerian literature extensively, creating the textual tradition that preserved works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Lamentation texts, and numerous hymns and myths. These weren't mere antiquarian exercises, but active engagement with a classical heritage. Later cultures claiming Sumerian achievements as their own ancestral legacy. Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian king ruling around 1792 to 1750 BCE, presented himself as restorer of temples first built by Sumerian kings, positioning his dynasty in continuity with the ancient past, even though ethnically and linguistically his regime represented a break. Religious continuity proved stronger than political or linguistic continuity. The temples to Enlil at Nippur, to Nana at Ur, to Inanna at Uruk continued functioning through the Babylonian period and beyond, their rituals maintained by priests who preserved traditions stretching back centuries. Gods' names changed slightly, Sumerian Nana becoming Akkadian Sin, Inanna becoming Istar, but the deities themselves remained recognizable. The cosmic geography described in Sumerian texts, with its heavenly realms and underworld regions, persisted in Babylonian mythology with minimal modification. Archaeological evidence shows how cities transformed rather than disappeared, or continued being inhabited, though it reduced population levels for another 1500 years after Earth III's collapse. New temples were built on the foundations of old ones, maintaining sacred geography even while architectural styles evolved. The ziggurat received repairs and renovations from successive dynasties, each claiming credit for restoring what previous rulers had supposedly neglected. This continuity of sacred space created physical links connecting later inhabitants to their Sumerian predecessors. Cultural practices survived in modified forms. Cuneiform writing, invented by Sumerians, continued being used throughout Mesopotamia for another 2,000 years, adapting to write multiple languages, until finally being replaced by alphabetic scripts in the early centuries CE. Mathematical systems based on sexagesimal notation, a Sumerian innovation, influenced Babylonian astronomy, and eventually passed into Greek science and modern timekeeping. Legal concepts pioneered in Sumerian law codes shaped Hammurabi's famous code and subsequent Mesopotamian jurisprudence. The question of divine abandonment, so central to lamentation literature, received varied answers from successor cultures. Some Babylonian texts acknowledged that Sumerian gods had withdrawn from their cities during catastrophic periods, but claimed that proper ritual had coaxed them back, that divine presence had been restored through religious reform and temple reconstruction. This narrative allowed later dynasties to claim legitimacy through divine favor, while explaining the previous collapse as temporary divine displeasure rather than permanent abandonment. Other texts took a different approach, suggesting that gods had never truly left, but rather that human perception of divine presence depended on proper worship and political stability. When order collapsed, it seemed like gods had departed, but in reality, they'd been present all along, waiting for humans to restore proper conditions. This interpretation preserved divine constancy, while placing responsibility for catastrophe squarely on human failures. What modern observers might see as civilization's end, ancient Mesopotamians experienced as dynastic change and cultural evolution within ongoing traditions. The fact that Amorite kings rather than ethnic Sumerians ruled Mesopotamian cities mattered less than that those kings maintained temples, commissioned cuneiform tablets, and claimed connection to the ancient cultural heritage. Civilization, in this view, consists more in cultural practices and religious traditions than in ethnic or political continuity. Yet something was genuinely lost that can't be recovered through Babylonian preservation efforts: the living Sumerian language with its unique perspective on reality, the specific social structures that organized early Sumerian cities, the religious experiences of people who believed gods literally dwelled in temple sanctuaries. These vanished despite cultural continuity in other domains. What survived were fossils and echoes, preserved texts and architectural remains that later cultures interpreted through their own frameworks, rather than understanding as the original creators had. The stars continued their cycles unchanged by human drama below. Constellations the Sumerians had charted and named still marked seasonal changes, still guided travelers and farmers. The astronomical knowledge they developed was inherited and elaborated by Babylonian scholars who pushed predictive astronomy to new heights. In this domain at least, Sumerian achievement didn't end, but rather provided foundation for subsequent advances that wouldn't have been possible without that inheritance. Perhaps civilizations don't truly end so much as transform, their essential elements recombining with new influences to create hybrid cultures that deny simple narratives of death and birth. The Sumerians as distinct people faded from history, but Sumerian culture permeated everything that followed in Mesopotamia, making their ending also a kind of immortality through absorption and transformation. The ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian collapse offers a radically different reading of the lamentation texts, one that takes divine departure literally rather than metaphorically. According to this framework, popularized by researchers like Zecharia Sitchin and elaborated by subsequent alternative historians, the Anunnaki were not mythological deities, but physical extraterrestrial beings whose actual departure from Earth, around 2000 BCE, caused the civilization they had founded and guided to collapse without their technological support and administrative oversight. This reading transforms theological poetry into eyewitness accounts of literal events, encoded in the only vocabulary available to Bronze Age observers. Sitchin's interpretation centers on the concept of Nibiru, a hypothetical planet on a 600-year elliptical orbit that supposedly brings it through the inner solar system periodically. He proposed that the Anunnaki traveled between Nibiru and Earth during close approaches, with their most recent departure occurring when the planet's orbit carried it away from our vicinity, around 2000 BCE. The timing aligns suspiciously well with Earth-3's collapse, suggesting to proponents that the correlation isn't coincidental but causal. When the Anunnaki left Earth to return home, the civilization dependent on their guidance couldn't maintain itself and rapidly deteriorated. This framework reinterprets specific elements from lamentation texts as descriptions of physical departure rather than theological metaphor. When texts describe gods removing the me from temples, alternative researchers see advanced technology being packed for transport. When Nana departs in 7 stages, passing through successive gates, this becomes a spacecraft launch sequence with multiple stages of ascent from temple platform to orbital altitude. The storms and fires accompanying divine departure transform into rocket exhaust and electromagnetic disturbances from advanced propulsion systems that primitive observers could only describe using natural phenomena terminology. The environmental collapse documented through soil salinization and declining crop yields gains different explanation in this reading. Perhaps the Anunnaki had provided technological solutions to manage irrigation without salt buildup, advanced drainage systems, or mineral extraction techniques that humans couldn't maintain after departure. The sudden inability to sustain agriculture wasn't purely natural degradation, but rather the failure of inherited technology that required knowledge humans didn't possess. Without extraterrestrial supervision, the complex systems collapsed into dysfunction. Military defeats and political fragmentation similarly receive alternative explanation. If the Anunnaki had imposed order through superior force and administrative capability, their absence would naturally lead to power struggles and invasions that no human authority could prevent. The Elamite conquest of Ur becomes less about inherent Sumerian weakness than about losing protection from beings whose advanced weaponry had previously deterred aggression. The successor Amorite dynasties represented local human powers filling a vacuum created by extraterrestrial withdrawal. Alternative researchers point to persistent mysteries in Sumerian texts as supporting evidence. Why do the lamentation poems describe divine council meetings in such concrete detail, with specific locations and procedural sequences? If these were purely imaginative theological constructions, why do multiple independent texts agree on the basic narrative of gods consciously choosing to abandon their cities? The specificity and consistency suggest to some readers that these accounts preserve distorted memories of actual events, rather than purely symbolic religious literature. The question of why extraterrestrials would abandon a civilization they'd supposedly invested millennia developing receives varied answers from alternative theorists. Some suggest the mission on Earth was complete, that whatever resources the Anunnaki sought had been extracted, and human civilization had reached self-sustaining levels, requiring no further intervention. Others propose conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, factional disputes that led to withdrawal of one group while another faction remained behind in reduced capacity. Still others imagine that departure was involuntary, forced by Nibiru's orbital mechanics, or by external threats requiring the Anunnaki to focus resources elsewhere. The appeal of this interpretation extends beyond explaining Sumerian collapse to offering a grand narrative of human origins and development. If extraterrestrials founded early civilizations, taught agriculture and writing and astronomy, then humanity's remarkable cultural achievements become less mysterious, less dependent on unlikely independent innovation by supposedly primitive peoples. The sudden appearance of complex civilization around 3500 BCE, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in myths and monuments, the architectural feats that seem to exceed Bronze Age capabilities, all find explanation through inherited extraterrestrial knowledge rather than purely human genius. Critics note that this framework requires reading ancient texts in ways their original authors likely never intended, imposing modern technological concepts onto religious poetry written for completely different purposes. The alternative reading strips lamentation literature of its theological sophistication, reducing complex explorations of divine justice and human suffering to simple reportage of spacecraft departures. Yet proponents respond that mainstream scholarship makes opposite error, dismissing potential historical kernels in myths by categorizing everything as purely symbolic. The debate ultimately centers on epistemology, how we know what we claim to know about the past. Mainstream archaeology builds interpretations from physical evidence, contextual analysis, and linguistic study, preferring naturalistic explanations that don't require unprecedented phenomena. Alternative research privileges textual accounts taken at face value, arguing that ancient peoples accurately described what they witnessed, even if they lacked vocabulary to explain it scientifically. Both approaches claim to honor the evidence, but they define evidence differently and apply different standards for evaluating competing theories. What remains undeniable is that something catastrophic occurred around 2000 BCE that ended Sumerian political independence and transformed Mesopotamian civilization fundamentally. Whether this transformation involved literal extraterrestrial departure or purely terrestrial environmental and political factors, the texts documenting divine abandonment speak to profound disruption that survivors struggle to comprehend and explain. Academic Sumerologists approach the lamentation texts as sophisticated theological literature produced by a culture in crisis, religious poetry that transformed historical trauma into cosmic drama through established literary conventions. This interpretation doesn't dismiss the texts as mere fiction, but recognizes them as complex responses to real disasters, attempts to make meaning from suffering by placing catastrophe in frameworks of divine will and moral causation. The god's departure represents metaphorical expression of what it felt like when military defeat, environmental collapse, and political fragmentation shattered assumptions about divine protection and civilizational permanence. Scholars point to extensive comparative evidence showing that cultures worldwide respond to catastrophic loss through similar theological narratives. When disasters strike that challenge fundamental beliefs about cosmic order and divine justice, religious communities produce literature wrestling with apparent contradictions between faith claims and experienced reality. The Book of Lamentations in Hebrew Bible responds to Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, using imagery and structure remarkably similar to earlier Mesopotamian laments. Greek literature contains laments for fallen cities. Medieval European texts mourn plague and invasion through religious frameworks attributing suffering to divine displeasure. These parallels suggest that lamentation literature represents a universal human response to civilizational trauma, rather than unique reporting of extraterrestrial events. The specific imagery of gods departing temples appears across cultures that had no contact with each other, indicating it emerges from common psychological and theological needs, rather than from shared observation of literal divine beings leaving Earth. When social order collapses and traditional beliefs fail to explain suffering, communities naturally imagine that divine powers have withdrawn favor or presence, creating theological explanations that preserve belief in cosmic justice, while acknowledging that protection isn't guaranteed. Linguistic analysis reveals how lamentation texts employ sophisticated literary techniques that mark them as carefully crafted poetry rather than eyewitness reportage. The repetition of key phrases, the structured arrangement into numbered songs or sections, the shifting perspectives between divine and human voices, these elements demonstrate authorial intent and artistic construction. The texts weren't hastily written accounts of traumatic events, but rather polished compositions produced sometime after the disasters they describe, created for liturgical performance during commemorative ceremonies. The archaeological record supports naturalistic explanations for Ruthless' collapse, without requiring extraterrestrial intervention. Soil scientists can document salinization processes through chemical analysis of ancient field systems. Climate researchers identify drought periods through ice cores and lake sediments. Military historians trace Elamite expansion through fortification patterns and destruction layers. The convergence of environmental stress, climate shift and political pressure provides sufficient explanation for civilizational collapse that occurred throughout human history before and since, requiring no unprecedented phenomena. Scholars also note internal contradictions in alternative interpretations that undermine their coherence. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced technology capable of interstellar travel, why would they need human labor for agricultural work or resource extraction? Automated systems would be far more efficient than managing slave populations. If they could control weather and geology, why would soil salinization occur at all? The scenario makes sense only if we project contemporary science fiction tropes onto ancient texts without considering whether the implications hold up under logical scrutiny. The question of why ancient peoples described astronomical phenomena with such precision receives straightforward answers from mainstream astronomy. Mesopotamian sky watchers spent centuries conducting naked-eye observations, tracking planetary movements and stellar positions with remarkable dedication. Their astronomical tablets demonstrate systematic data collection over generations, mathematical modeling to predict celestial events, and sophisticated understanding of cycles and patterns. This represents impressive human achievement, but nothing exceeding capabilities of careful observation, patient record-keeping, and mathematical reasoning. Modern experimental archaeology demonstrates that Bronze Age peoples possessed sufficient knowledge and capability to achieve the architectural and engineering feats found in Sumerian cities without requiring advanced technology. Researchers have successfully replicated ancient construction techniques using tools and materials available in the 3rd millennium BCE, showing that massive mud brick structures, sophisticated irrigation systems, and monumental ziggurats could be built through organized human labor, applying empirical knowledge accumulated across generations. Perhaps most fundamentally, mainstream scholarship objects to alternative readings on methodological grounds. Good historical method requires proportionality between extraordinary claims and extraordinary evidence. Proposing that ancient texts describe extraterrestrial contact represents an extraordinary claim requiring evidence beyond ambiguous textual passages subject to multiple interpretations. The burden of proof lies with those making unprecedented claims, and alternative researchers haven't met that burden through rigorous documentation and peer-reviewed analysis that withstands expert scrutiny. Yet scholars acknowledge their own tendency toward conservative interpretations that might occasionally dismiss genuine anomalies deserving investigation. Academic institutions can be resistant to paradigm-challenging ideas, sometimes to their detriment. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive stone temple complex dated to 9600 BCE, surprised archaeologists who hadn't expected such sophisticated architecture so early. This finding demonstrates that conventional timelines sometimes require revision when new evidence emerges, validating caution about being overly confident in current understandings. The healthiest approach might involve separating specific claims from broader questions. We can reject particular alternative interpretations as unsupported, while remaining open to mysteries that conventional explanations haven't fully resolved. How did Sumerian civilization emerge so rapidly around 3500 BCE? What social and cognitive developments enabled the sudden appearance of writing, complex administration, and urban planning? These questions deserve continued investigation, even if ancient astronauts aren't the answer. The debate between mainstream and alternative interpretations ultimately reflects different ways of relating to the past. Academic scholarship emphasizes rigorous methodology, contextual analysis, and naturalistic explanation, seeking to understand ancient cultures on their own terms, rather than through modern preconceptions. Alternative research privileges, intuitive readings of texts, and willingness to consider unconventional possibilities, critiquing academic conservatism as potentially missing important truths. Both approaches claim to honor ancient voices, but they listen for different things and hear different messages in the silence between words pressed into clay millennia ago. Stepping back from debates about extraterrestrials and divine abandonment, the Sumerian collapse reveals patterns that appear throughout human history with unsettling regularity. Civilizations rise through innovation and organized effort, reach peaks of achievement that seem permanent, then decline through combinations of environmental stress, political fragmentation, and external pressure. The specific details vary. The Sumerians faced soil salinization, while the Maya confronted drought, and the Romans dealt with different challenges, but the fundamental cycle of emergence, fluorescence, and collapse repeats across cultures and continents, with enough consistency to suggest common underlying dynamics. Environmental degradation appears as a nearly universal factor in civilizational decline. Intensive agriculture depletes soil nutrients or, in arid regions, accumulates toxic salt concentrations. Deforestation for fuel and construction removes tree cover that prevents erosion and maintains watersheds. Irrigation systems silt up or breach, requiring constant maintenance that failing states can't provide. The very practices that enable civilizations to flourish simultaneously undermine the ecological foundations on which they rest, creating time-delayed consequences that become apparent only after irreversible damage has occurred. Climate variability compounds human-caused environmental problems. The droughts that stressed Mesopotamia around 2200 to 2000 BCE weren't unique to that region or period. Paleoclimatic research documents similar arid episodes affecting civilizations worldwide. The 4.2 kiloyear event that disrupted societies from Egypt to India, the terminal classic drought that contributed to Maya collapse around 900 CE, the medieval climate anomaly and subsequent Little Ice Age that challenged European societies. Civilizations adapted to specific climate patterns find themselves vulnerable when those patterns shift beyond the range their infrastructure can accommodate. Political dynamics follow predictable trajectories as well. Successful states expand through military conquest or economic integration, incorporating diverse populations under centralized administration. This expansion creates wealth and power, but also generates internal tensions between ethnic groups, regional factions, and social classes. When central authority weakens through incompetent leadership, succession disputes, or resource depletion, centrifugal forces pull empires apart into competing fragments. The Earthly Empire's disintegration into rival Amorite kingdoms followed patterns visible in Roman collapse, Chinese dynastic cycles, and countless other examples. External pressures intensify during periods of internal weakness. Nomadic peoples on civilization's frontiers, the Amorites threatening Mesopotamia, or the Germanic tribes pressing against Rome, typically aren't strong enough to challenge healthy empires, but exploit opportunities when states falter. Migrations and invasions that earlier strength repelled successfully overwhelmed declining powers, not because invaders suddenly became more formidable, but because defensive capabilities eroded through environmental stress and political dysfunction. The same walls and armies that protected during prosperity prove inadequate when resources shrink and social cohesion fractures. What makes these patterns particularly striking is that civilizations rarely learn from others' mistakes. The Romans had access to Greek historical accounts describing how city-states rose and fell. Chinese dynasties studied records of previous dynastic cycles. Medieval Europeans possessed Roman texts warning about overextension and environmental degradation. Yet each civilization tends to believe its situation is unique, its achievements permanent, its vulnerabilities manageable through the same strategies that created the vulnerabilities in the first place. The confidence that civilization has solved fundamental problems of human organization appears precisely when those solutions are failing. The Sumerian lamentation texts, in this context, represent something more universal than specific theological crisis or extraterrestrial departure. They express the bewildered grief of populations experiencing civilizational collapse, watching familiar institutions crumble and certainties dissolve. Whether framed as divine abandonment or political failure, the psychological experience is similar. What seemed permanent proves fragile, what seemed protected proves vulnerable, what seemed comprehensible becomes mysterious and threatening. The texts speak to that moment of transition from confidence to confusion that appears during every civilization's decline. Archaeological surveys documenting settlement patterns across Mesopotamia reveal the long-term consequences of Sumerian collapse. The early Bronze Age landscape from 3500–2000 BCE shows dense settlement networks, villages and towns spreading across southern Iraq as population grew and prosperity expanded. After 2000 BCE, dramatic population decline appears in the archaeological record. Many sites abandoned permanently, survivors consolidating in fewer urban centers. The landscape partially emptied, reverting to pastoral use as intensive agriculture became unsustainable. Recovery took centuries, and when cities eventually flourished again, they did so under different organizational principles and ethnic compositions. This pattern of rise, peak, collapse, and eventual partial recovery repeats throughout history. The Indus Valley civilization of roughly the same period experienced similar trajectory, flourishing between 2600 to 1900 BCE, then declining into scattered rural settlements before later cultures repopulated the region. Classic Maya civilization in Central America built spectacular cities that were largely abandoned between 800–1000 CE, with populations dispersing into smaller communities. Angkor in Cambodia supported hundreds of thousands during its peak in the 12th century CE, before gradual abandonment left temple complexes to jungle overgrowth. Each case involves unique specific factors, but the overall pattern suggests civilization itself contains inherent vulnerabilities. Modern industrial civilization faces comparable challenges despite technological sophistication that ancient peoples lacked. Climate change driven by fossil fuel consumption parallels, though, exceeds ancient deforestation and soil degradation. Resource depletion, biodiversity loss, and environmental pollution create long-term threats that short-term economic and political systems struggle to address effectively. Political fragmentation along ethnic, ideological, and economic lines weakens capacity for collective action. The patterns aren't identical, but the fundamental tension between civilization's demands and ecological limits persists. Perhaps this is what the Sumerian collapse ultimately teaches, not that gods depart or aliens leave, but that human achievements rest on foundations more fragile than their builders typically recognize. Every civilization believes itself exceptional until events prove otherwise. The clay tablets recording Ur's destruction serve less as unique historical curiosity than as a reminder that collapse is always possible, that the cycle continues, that what seems permanent in one generation becomes ruins for another to excavate and ponder. The stars that watched Sumerian cities rise and fall continue their ancient rhythms, indifferent to human achievements and failures. Civilizations are brief flickers in cosmic time, momentary self-organization of matter and energy that inevitably dissipates back into disorder. The silence that eventually claims all cities, all empires, all human endeavors isn't divine punishment or extraterrestrial abandonment, but simply entropy operating as it always has and always will. Archaeological and geological sciences offer tools for investigating past events that ancient peoples couldn't access, methods that reveal evidence independent of textual accounts and potentially adjudicate between competing interpretations. The Earth itself preserves records of climate shifts, environmental changes, and human activities through multiple physical signatures that researchers can read with increasing precision. What these natural archives tell us about the late 3rd millennium BCE provides context for understanding why Sumerian civilization collapsed, though the evidence rarely offers simple answers and often raises new questions. Soil chemistry analyses conducted at ancient Sumerian agricultural sites document salinization levels with quantitative precision. Researchers extract core samples from fields that haven't been cultivated for 4,000 years, measuring electrical conductivity and specific ion concentrations at different depths. The data shows salt accumulation reaching 2 to 3% by weight in the root zone by 2000 BCE, levels that suppress most crop growth. Some scholars interpret this as conclusive evidence that environmental degradation caused civilizational collapse through agricultural failure. Others note that salinization was gradual, accumulating over centuries, yet collapse came relatively suddenly, suggesting environmental stress was necessary, but not sufficient explanation for the catastrophe. Climate reconstructions from multiple proxy sources indicate significant aridification in the Middle East during the late 3rd millennia BCE. Ice cores from Greenland show markers of atmospheric dust consistent with increased aridity and desertification. Sediment cores from the Dead Sea reveal low water levels during this period. Speleothem records from caves in the Levant document reduced precipitation between 2200 and 2000 BCE. The convergence of evidence from independent sources creates confidence that drought conditions were real and severe. Yet we may never know exactly how this climate shift affected specific Sumerian cities, how farmers adapted or failed to adapt, how precipitation decline translated into agricultural collapse and social unrest. Pollen analysis from sediment layers tells stories of changing vegetation patterns. Cores extracted from ancient lake beds and marshes show declining arboreal pollen and increasing grass pollen during the late 3rd millennium BCE, indicating deforestation and expansion of grazing lands. This evidence suggests environmental transformation was substantial, forests giving way to more arid landscapes. Perhaps this shift resulted purely from human activities, over-harvesting timber for construction and fuel. Maybe climate change caused forests to die back naturally, and humans simply exploited what remained. The evidence indicates change but doesn't always clarify causation with certainty. Stratigraphic excavations at urban sites reveal destruction layers, datable through ceramic typology and radiocarbon analysis, to around 2000 BCE. Burnt mud brick, collapsed walls, and human remains in positions suggesting violent death all document catastrophic events. The physical evidence confirms that something terrible happened. Cities were destroyed and populations displaced or killed. Some researchers see this as validating textual accounts of Elamite invasion and urban warfare. Others propose more complex scenarios involving internal revolts, multiple military campaigns, or prolonged sieges. The destruction is clear, but its precise nature and sequence often remains ambiguous. Isotopic analysis of human remains from this period offers insights into diet, migration patterns, and health status. Strontium isotopes in tooth enamel can identify whether individuals grew up locally or migrated from distant regions, potentially distinguishing native Sumerians from Amorite immigrants. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone collagen reveal dietary patterns, showing shifts in what people ate as food systems transformed. Some studies suggest declining nutrition and increasing disease markers in populations experiencing civilizational stress. Yet sample sizes are often small and interpretations contested. The evidence hints at patterns without providing complete demographic pictures. Archaeological surveys mapping settlement distributions across southern Mesopotamia document dramatic population decline after 2000 BCE. Sites occupied during the Ur-3 period show abandonment, with rural villages disappearing entirely from landscapes that had supported dense agricultural populations. Urban centers shrank to fractions of their former size. The pattern is unambiguous. Something caused massive depopulation and settlement contraction. We may never fully understand whether people died, migrated elsewhere, or dispersed into nomadic lifestyles that leave minimal archaeological traces. The empty landscape speaks of loss but guards secrets about where the missing populations went. What the Earth doesn't reveal, however, are the subjective experiences and religious interpretations that mattered so much to those living through the collapse. No soil sample or pollen grain preserves what it felt like to watch harvests fail year after year, to see temple ceremonies that should ensure divine favor apparently accomplish nothing, to question whether gods had abandoned their worshippers or never existed at all. The physical evidence documents environmental and military catastrophes, but remains silent about the theological crises and emotional trauma that the lamentation texts express so poignantly. Scientific methods also can't definitively resolve debates about alternative interpretations. No archaeological technique can prove or disprove whether extraterrestrial beings were present in ancient Mesopotamia, because we don't know what traces such beings would leave or how to distinguish them from purely human activities. The absence of exotic materials or unexplainable technologies suggests no advanced intervention occurred, but absence of evidence isn't conclusive proof of absence. Alternative researchers argue that sophisticated beings would naturally remove most traces when departing, making archaeological investigation inherently limited. Perhaps the most important insight from geological and archaeological sciences is humility about how much remains uncertain despite sophisticated analytical methods. We can document environmental stresses and violent destructions, can trace population movements and dietary changes, can reconstruct climate conditions and agricultural productivity, but the leap from physical evidence to comprehensive historical narrative always involves interpretation, selection of which evidence to emphasize, assumptions about causation and motivation. The Earth reveals many things, yet also withholds others, preserving traces, but not always meanings. The silence of ruins and soil invites projection, allowing different observers to find confirmation for divergent theories, depending on what questions they ask and what frameworks they bring to interpretation. This isn't failure of scientific method, but rather acknowledgement of its proper scope. Science excels at answering certain kinds of questions about physical processes and measurable phenomena. Other questions, about meaning and value and religious experience, require different approaches that evidence alone can't fully resolve. The memory of Sumerian collapse persisted long after the events themselves, preserved through multiple channels that transformed historical trauma into cultural heritage across millennia. Later Mesopotamian civilizations maintained active engagement with this ancient catastrophe, copying lamentation texts, performing commemorative rituals, and claiming connection to the vanished Sumerian past. This persistence of memory served functions beyond mere historical record-keeping, creating frameworks for understanding subsequent disasters and providing templates for expressing collective grief that remained relevant centuries after Ur fell. Babylonian scribes of the Old Babylonian period, 2000 to 1600 BCE, and later continued copying Sumerian lamentation texts with remarkable fidelity, preserving language and content even as their own culture evolved. These weren't casual copies, but carefully executed manuscripts that teachers used in scribal schools, advanced students learning classical Sumerian through engagement with these emotionally powerful texts. The practice suggests that memory of collapse functioned as education, each generation learning from predecessors' experiences and maintaining literacy in a sacred language associated with civilization's foundational period. The lamentation tradition didn't remain static, but evolved to address new catastrophes using established patterns. When Babylon fell to Hittite raiders around 1595 BCE, scribes composed new laments following Sumerian models, describing how Marduk abandoned his city just as Nana had left Ur centuries earlier. Later, when Assyrian armies sacked Babylon in 689 BCE, more laments appeared employing familiar imagery of divine departure and urban destruction. The template proved remarkably adaptable, capable of making sense of repeated cycles of rise and fall that characterized Mesopotamian history. Perhaps the most striking example of memory persistence appears in biblical literature. The Book of Lamentations, composed after Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, employs structures and imagery remarkably similar to earlier Mesopotamian city laments. Scholars debate whether this represents direct literary influence or independent parallel development, responding to similar trauma. Either way, the patterns suggest deep human needs to process catastrophic loss through formalized grief expression that connects personal experience to cosmic significance. The questions raised by Sumerian collapse, why do gods allow their chosen cities to fall, continued resonating across cultures and centuries. Some researchers propose that folk memories of ancient catastrophes might preserve kernels of accurate information across vast time spans through oral tradition. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastal geography that existed when sea levels were lower during the last ice age, suggesting these narratives retain details from over 10,000 years ago. If oral memory can survive such spans, maybe Mesopotamian traditions preserved genuine historical memories from the distant past, climate events and social upheavals that later generations encoded in mythological frameworks. The alternative is that similar disasters recur frequently enough that each generation's experiences reinforce rather than create the basic narrative patterns. The ziggurat at Ur itself became a memory site, successive rulers repairing and renovating the structure while claiming continuity with its original builder Ur-Nammu. Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus, ruling from 556 to 539 BCE, conducted extensive archaeological excavations at Ur, searching for foundation deposits from earlier construction phases. He commissioned inscriptions describing his restoration work and explicitly connecting his reign to the ancient Sumerian past. This represents perhaps the earliest known example of archaeological investigation motivated by desire to reconnect with lost heritage, making Nabonidus history's first archaeologist in some respects. We may never fully understand why later cultures maintained such active engagement with Sumerian collapse, rather than simply forgetting it. Maybe the disaster was so profound, so transformative, that it created permanent scar on regional cultural memory that couldn't heal or fade. Perhaps the theological questions raised by divine abandonment remained unresolved, each generation needing to wrestle anew with problems of suffering and cosmic justice that the laments articulated, or possibly the very act of remembering, served a apotropaic function, believing that commemorating past catastrophes might prevent their recurrence, or at least prepare communities for inevitable future disasters. Modern rediscovery of these ancient memories began with 19th century archaeological excavations that unearthed tablets containing lamentation texts. When scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer translated these poems in the mid-20th century, they encountered voices speaking across 4 millennia about experiences that remained somehow familiar, loss and grief and bewildered questioning that transcend specific historical circumstances. The texts resonated with modern readers who'd experienced their own civilizational traumas through world wars, genocides, and environmental crises, suggesting the questions Sumerians asked remain our questions too. Perhaps the deepest function of persistent memory is simply to acknowledge that what happened mattered, that the cities which fell and the people who suffered weren't meaningless accidents, but part of patterns deserving attention and respect. The lamentation text refused to let Sumerian collapse disappear silently into the past, insisting instead that loss be recognized, mourned, and remembered. This memorial function operates independently of whether divine abandonment was literal or metaphorical, whether extraterrestrials departed or purely human factors caused the catastrophe. The grief is real regardless of interpretation. The question of why civilizations fall admits no single answer, because each collapse involves unique combinations of environmental, political, military, and cultural factors interacting in contingent ways. Yet the persistence of Sumerian collapse in cultural memory suggests humans recognize something universal in this particular instance: patterns and dynamics that speak to perennial vulnerabilities in civilized life. We remember not because we've solved the problem, but because we know the problem persists, that our own civilizations rest on foundations no more secure than those that supported Ea 4,000 years ago. The tablets still exist in museum collections, their cuneiform marks as legible today as when first pressed into clay. The laments can still be read, still be performed, still evoke the emotions they were designed to express. Memory persists, not just passively through preservation, but actively through ongoing engagement, each generation finding in these ancient texts something that speaks to contemporary concerns. Maybe that's what memory ultimately is, not fixed record of the past, but living conversation between past and present, where meaning emerges from dialogue rather than residing solely in original events. The mystery isn't whether we can recover exactly what happened in 2004 BCE. Scientific and textual evidence provides substantial though incomplete answers to that historical question. The deeper mystery is why the question still matters, why these ancient voices still speak to us, why the problem of divine abandonment and civilizational collapse continues demanding our attention, even when we've developed frameworks that explain such events through natural processes, requiring no supernatural intervention. Perhaps mystery itself has value. Questions without definitive answers that keep us engaged with fundamental problems of human existence, rather than settling into false certainties that prevent deeper understanding. The conversation between Sumerian collapse and modern consciousness didn't begin with academic archaeology, but rather with chance discoveries by Europeans exploring Ottoman Iraq in the mid-19th century. Local inhabitants had long known that ancient tells contained buried cities, occasionally finding baked clay tablets when ploughing fields or digging wells, but they lacked methods to read the wedge-shaped marks and typically discarded or destroyed these artifacts as worthless curiosities. The systematic rediscovery of Sumerian civilization required outsiders to recognize that these mounds and tablets held historical significance, to develop techniques for excavation and translation, and to persist through decades of painstaking work that gradually resurrected voices silent for millennia. Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh in the 1840s yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets that eventually reached European museums, where scholars wrestled with decipherment. The breakthrough came through Persian inscriptions that provided keys to unlock Mesopotamian languages, allowing researchers like Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks to crack the cuneiform code by the 1850s. Suddenly, texts that had been meaningless patterns became readable documents, administrative records and myths and lamentation poems, speaking directly across 4,000 years. The discovery that biblical flood narratives had Mesopotamian antecedents created sensation in Victorian England, challenging assumptions about scriptural uniqueness and revealing unexpected depth in supposedly primitive ancient cultures. Leonard Woolley's systematic excavations at Ur between 1922 and 1934 captured public imagination worldwide. His discovery of the Royal Cemetery, with its spectacular gold and lapis lazuli treasures, made headlines, but his careful stratigraphic work documenting occupation layers from 5000 BCE through the Islamic period provided the chronological framework that allowed scholars to trace Sumerian civilization's entire arc. Woolley recognized destruction layers dating to Ur's fall in 2004 BCE, providing physical confirmation of catastrophe described in lamentation texts. His published reports and popular books brought Sumerian history to general audiences, making these ancient people feel real and immediate rather than abstractly distant. Even now, new tablets emerge from museum storage rooms where they've rested since excavation decades or centuries ago. The British Museum alone holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform texts, with significant portions still untranslated or unpublished. Yale's Babylonian collection contains over 45,000 items requiring study. Each year, scholars working through these archives discover previously unknown texts or join fragments that complete damaged compositions, incrementally expanding knowledge about Sumerian religion, administration, and literature. A tablet translated for the first time this year might contain details about divine abandonment or collapse dynamics that earlier researchers never encountered. Modern archaeological techniques reveal information invisible to earlier excavators. Ground-penetrating radar maps buried structures without disturbing them. Satellite imagery detects ancient irrigation patterns through subtle vegetation differences. Soil chemistry analysis documents salinization processes. Isotopic studies of human remains trace diet and migration. These methods answer questions that Woolley couldn't have asked with 1920s technology, showing how environmental degradation and demographic shifts contributed to civilizational collapse in ways that ancients couldn't have understood scientifically, though they experienced the consequences directly. The question of why divine abandonment narratives still resonate with modern audiences demands reflection. We live in largely secular societies where most people don't literally believe gods dwell in temples or control agricultural yields through favor or displeasure. Yet the lamentation texts speak to contemporary readers with surprising emotional power, their expressions of bewildered grief and theological crisis, feeling somehow familiar despite radical differences in worldview. Perhaps this resonance indicates that the underlying human experiences, watching familiar institutions fail, questioning whether suffering has meaning, struggling to maintain hope amid collapse, these remain constant across cultural and temporal divides. Still today, the ziggurat at Ur rises from the Iraqi desert, its reconstructed facade, giving tourists some sense of the original monument's scale. Though most visitors can't access the site due to regional instability, the structure has survived 4,000 years of erosion, earthquakes, wars, and neglect. Through sheer massive solidity, millions of baked bricks resisting forces that destroyed everything else around them. Standing in its shadow, you feel the weight of accumulated time, the persistence of human ambition, literally embodied in architecture, that outlasts the civilization that built it. The platform is empty now, the temple long vanished, but the foundation endures as testament to what was achieved before abandonment. The legacy extends beyond academic knowledge into broader cultural consciousness. References to Sumerian collapse appear in contemporary discussions about environmental sustainability, political fragility, and civilizational resilience. When climate scientists warn about anthropogenic environmental degradation, they sometimes invoke Sumerian salinization as historical precedent, showing that civilizations can inadvertently destroy ecological foundations supporting them. When political commentators discuss imperial overextension or social polarization, Sumerian fragmentation provides case study in how empires fragment under internal and external pressures. The ancient example becomes mirror reflecting contemporary anxieties about our own civilization's vulnerabilities. Perhaps the deepest legacy lies in the questions rather than answers. The Sumerians asked whether divine beings truly cared about human welfare, whether proper worship guaranteed protection, why catastrophic suffering befell cities that believed themselves divinely favored. Modern frameworks translate these questions into secular vocabulary, asking whether the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human concerns, whether technological sophistication provides security against environmental and social collapse, why disasters strike seemingly at random without correlation to moral merit. The theological language changes, but the fundamental wondering persists, suggesting these questions emerge from human condition itself, rather than from specific cultural contexts. The texts remain available for anyone to read in translation, published in accessible editions and increasingly available online. The lamentation over Ur's destruction, the curse of Agad, the administrative tablets documenting declining harvests, all exist as primary sources that modern readers can engage directly without mediation. This democratization of access means the Sumerian voices speak not just to scholars, but to anyone curious about how ancient peoples experienced and interpreted civilizational collapse. You can read their actual words, pressed into clay by scribes who lived through catastrophe, and judge for yourself what they convey about divine abandonment and human resilience. The conversation continues in every person who encounters these texts and wrestles with their implications. When you listen to this exploration tonight, you become part of an unbroken chain of engagement, stretching back through generations of scholars and scribes to the original Sumerian authors created lamentation literature as response to trauma. Your attention extends the legacy forward, carries these ancient questions into whatever future emerges from our own moment of environmental and social stress. The story doesn't end with archaeological excavation or academic translation, but lives on in minds considering what Sumerian collapse means for understanding our own civilization's trajectory. The stars that Sumerian astronomers charted still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The same constellations that marked planting and harvest seasons for farmers 4,000 years ago continue their predictable cycles, indifferent to whether anyone observes them or whether civilizations rise and fall beneath their distant light. This continuity offers both comfort and unsettling reminder. Comfort that some things persist regardless of human drama, unsettling recognition that the universe doesn't particularly care about our achievements or our survival. We make meaning through attention and memory, keeping alive questions and stories that matter to us, even when cosmic forces remain unmoved. Perhaps you carry this story differently now than when we began together hours ago, having traced the arc from Sumerian confidence through catastrophic collapse to persistent memory across millennia. The knowledge changes nothing about what happened in 2004 BCE, but it changes something about how you understand patterns that repeat through history, including patterns still unfolding in the civilization you inhabit today. That shift in understanding, small though it may be, represents the legacy's continuation, ancient voices still shaping how we think about civilization's fragility, and the enduring mystery of why human achievements always prove temporary. Come back now to wherever you're resting, to the weight of your body settled against fabric or mattress, to the temperature of air moving gently across skin, to the quiet sounds of your immediate surroundings. The ancient past has held your attention through these hours, but the present moment waits patiently, unchanged by all those stories of gods and collapse and cities emptied of their voices. Your breathing continues its steady rhythm. The room around you maintains its familiar dimensions. Whatever digital clock shows nearby, whatever darkness or light fills windows, this moment exists independent of Sumerian lamentation and archaeological debate. In Iraqi museums and storage facilities, clay tablets still rest in climate-controlled cases or on archival shelves, their surfaces covered with cuneiform marks pressed by fingers that turned to dust 4,000 years ago. The wedges catch light differently depending on angle, creating tiny shadows that make the writing appear almost to move when you shift perspective. These tablets outlasted the empire that created them, survived complete forgetting of their language, endured through centuries when no one could read them or cared what they said. They wait now as they've always waited, patient as stone, indifferent to whether we interpret them as theology or history, metaphor or memory. The same stars the Sumerian priests tracked from ziggurat platforms still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Planets still trace paths through the zodiac, following orbital mechanics unchanged since long before humans existed to observe them. The moon still cycles through phases that once marked ritual calendars and agricultural seasons. These celestial patterns persist regardless of whether anyone charts them, regardless of whether civilizations rise beneath their light, or collapse into silence. Perhaps this is what we should take from these hours of exploration, that some things continue beyond human interpretation and understanding, that mystery doesn't diminish with investigation but deepens, revealing layers beneath layers of questions we've barely begun to ask. We may never know with certainty whether the Anunnaki were gods who departed, or extraterrestrials who left Earth, or mythological constructions encoding environmental catastrophe and political collapse. The evidence allows multiple readings, each internally consistent within its assumptions, yet incompatible with alternatives. Scholars will continue refining translations and excavating new sites. Alternative researchers will propose fresh frameworks for understanding ancient accounts. The conversation continues without reaching final resolution, and maybe that's exactly appropriate for questions touching on origins and endings, divine presence and absence, the meaning we make from suffering and loss. What remains after all the exploration is simpler than theories or translations. Ancient people built cities and temples, developed writing to preserve their thoughts, created literature that speaks across millennia about experiences both utterly alien and strangely familiar. They asked where they came from and imagined answers. They experienced catastrophes and encoded them in narratives, providing meaning to chaos. Whether gods or humans alone produced these achievements, the achievements themselves demonstrate something remarkable about consciousness emerging from matter, about minds capable of asking questions that exceed their capacity to answer definitively. The wind still moves across Iraqi deserts, stirring sand around tells that hold buried neighborhoods and forgotten lives. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though modern dams and irrigation have tamed their ancient unpredictability. Bricks stamped with names of long-dead kings rest where they've rested for 40 centuries, holding their shape while empires rise and fall around them, while languages are born and die, while humans continue asking questions their ancestors asked in different words, seeking answers that perhaps don't exist in the forms we imagine, finding instead more questions, deeper mysteries, connections to patterns that repeat through time without revealing ultimate meanings. Rest now in not knowing. The tablets will be there tomorrow. The questions persist. The ruins stand patient under stars that remember nothing and everything, watching as they've always watched, indifferent, eternal, silent witnesses to all that arises and all that passes away, including this moment, this breath, this listening,